Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We are going to go ahead and get started with our next installment of FCS Financial's Grow Together webinar series. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. My name is Madison Farnan, Marketplace Engagement Manager, and excited to have you here with me. At FCS Financial, we know your time is valuable, and we won't keep you away from your operation long. Every session in this series is built to be professional, concise, and focus on your bottom line. So today we're diving into a topic that serves as the foundation for a financial decision making, whether you're looking to buy, sell, or refinance, how to read your appraisal. We want to move beyond just the number on a page to give you the true transparency into how appraisers determine market value. Today I'm joined by Will Gabbert. He serves as Vice President of Appraisal located in the FCS Financial Maryville branch. After graduating from Concordia University in Nebraska with an agriculture business degree, he began working at FCS Financial in 2016 as an appraisal trainee. In 2019, he obtained his certified general appraisal license from the state of Missouri. He's also licensed in Iowa and occasionally performs appraisal work for member owners across the state line. Today, Will is going to break down how to decode your report, specifically the summary page, the scope of work, evaluate the sales comparison approach, and understand core economic and physical drivers that impact your property's value. Will, I will hand the floor over to you. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Madison. Thanks for that introduction. Like Madison said, my name is Will Gabbert. I work out of Northwest Missouri up here at FCS Financial. Been here about 10 years now. So just to get started, I'm going to share my screen and kind of give you guys a brief overview of the appraisal department that we have here at FCS Financial. As you can see from the graphic, we have a total of 12 appraisers on staff, as well as 2 additional appraisal operations specialists. Of our 12 appraisers, we have 1 chief appraiser, 2 team leaders, 7 vice presidents or certified general appraisers, and then also 2 appraisal trainees. Not, like I said, mentioned, you can see from the graphic, cover the majority of the state and just have a good team of appraisal professionals out there for you guys. We also have on our appraisal staff 4 collateral evaluators. They handle our chattel appraisals as well as they do a lot of real estate for us. On some of those less risk, lower loan amount loans that we have coming here at FCS, they handle a lot of those for us. So very valuable tool. All right, diving in here. I figured it'd be good to start just with a brief definition. What is an appraisal? What is an appraiser? These definitions are taken from USPAP. I'm sure majority of you probably aren't familiar, but USPAP is kind of the governing body of appraisals all over the state and country. They lay out the guidelines, ethics, and a lot of the fundamental rules appraisers should be following. For an appraisal, the active process of developing an opinion of value, and this could be, usually it's through an appraisal report, a hard copy, but this could also be verbal, verbally spoken. An appraiser definition: one who is expected to perform valuation services competently in a manner that is independent, impartial, and objective. The biggest thing to take away from that would be the one, competently. The appraiser knows what he's doing. He's competent in appraising that farm, facility, whatever it may be, but also he's acting independently and objectively. There's no outside forces at play there. He's looking at the property as the market would look at it. Moving forward, and I know this is kind of a long slide. Don't worry, I'm not going to read it all. It's out there for you guys to look over. But the fundamental purpose of an appraisal report, the majority of the time here at FCS, is to determine current market value. There are times where we're not after current market value. Maybe we're after a value in the past called a retrospective appraisal. That could be for, tax purposes, or maybe a date of death. A family member died, you need to appraise a farm as that date. There's retrospective, there's also prospective appraisals. Don't see those narrowed often, but that's a value in the future. But like I said, 99% of the time, here at FCS, we're after the current market value of a property. Like I said, I'll briefly go over some of the main points here, but farm credit's definition of a market value, which is what we're trying to attain at the end of the day when we value a property. Both buyer and seller need to be motivated, typically motivated to sell. There's no outside influences. They're both motivated to sell and purchase the property. Also, they need to be well-informed buyers and sellers. They understand the market area. They know roughly kind of what values are, and are just aware of the overall market conditions where the property is located. There also needs to be a reasonable exposure time out there on the market. For example, it's not I got to sell this week, so I'm probably going to take a lesser amount for my property. That wouldn't be considered, a typical market value. Also, no outside influence as far as, when it comes to financing, whether that be maybe an owner financing deal or any sort of, odd thing there. So all those come into play when we're trying to break down and get to market value. At FCS here, we use a handful of tools, but there's the three main appraisal reports that we use. The first one would be the desktop restricted report, and kind of as the name implies, it's a very valuable tool. No inspection is required for that appraisal. Like I mentioned before, typically on some of these lower risk deals, FCS has parameters that we follow, but there's a section of those that qualify for desktop appraisal reports. Like I said, no inspection required. We can sit at our desk. We can make our maps up. We can do it all from our desk. And typically with these, we usually only utilize one of our approaches to value. And here a little bit later, I'll talk about the different approaches to value we have. But that's a major time saver, and very efficient way to knock out some work. The next tier would be the restricted appraisal report. This also is not a full-blown 3-approach appraisal report. It is, condensed down. And like I said, here at FCS, we have parameters we follow. This is kind of a mid-tier based on loan amount and risk. With this one, an inspection is required. And typically, in everyday appraisal life, whenever I'm using the restricted report, it would be because there may be a dwelling, a shed, or some structural improvement out on the property that we just really need to lay eyes on, to get a good feel for condition of the improvement, and the overall value that it's going to contribute. So, and with this one, typically one or two of our approaches to value, and that suffices there. So like I said, usually with a restricted, if you got 80 acres crop ground with a house, shed, something along those lines is where we're going to be utilizing that type of report. Finally, we have our full-blown appraisal report. You can utilize up to all 3 approaches in this report. And just like restricted, an inspection is required to lay eyes on the property. Usually these are some of the higher tier, loan amounts, maybe a little more risk. A lot of the times we'll see full-blown appraisal reports with whether it be poultry, hog facilities, grain facilities, fertilizer facilities, things like that, where you just really, it's a deep dive into there to conclude, maybe utilize all 3 approaches so you've got good backup for your values and things of that nature. So move on here. Within those appraisal reports, all of those appraisal reports have various sections and portions. I've got 4 here that I feel you really need to have a pretty good understanding when you receive a report back or for reviewing a report, just to get an idea of what all went on, what did the appraiser do throughout that appraisal project to conclude to his value. The first section of that, it's pretty self-explanatory, the summary page. It's at the very beginning. It outlines a lot of just the basic subject property features, whether that be location, section, township, range, county. It'll give you an address. It also kind of goes over, it will show the final value opinion. There's places further on down there that give you a little more details, but it is just a brief summary. And it also, it lists out your intended user. 95% of the time here at FCS, our intended use for an appraisal would be for mortgage lending purposes. But you can get out into the, if you're doing fee projects for estate planning purposes, different things like that, you'll want to review that and make sure that intended use and intended user line up with what you're needing and what you requested. The next section that I feel is important is the scope of work and or the appraisal requirement section. This section will discuss, your different approaches, why you used them, or why you didn't use them. So like I said, if we've got a vacant 80 acres highly tillable crop ground, no structural improvements, most likely not going to use the cost approach, but it spells out why I didn't use an approach or why I did. It also will discuss, like kind of as the name implies, any appraisal requirements. So anything that the customer requested, be done a certain way. But it also will discuss any environmental concerns the appraiser found, and then also any hypothetical conditions or extraordinary assumptions throughout the report. I know some of these terms may be foreign if you're not in the appraisals every day. Hypothetical conditions, for example, would be on a new construction dwelling on a farm. You usually use those hypothetical conditions if you're appraising the property as if the dwelling was completed. So like I said, some of these terms may be a little foreign, but happy to provide any explanation further. Moving on to the next section that I feel is very important for a good understanding and kind of knowing what you're getting in your appraisal would be the highest and best use page. Every property has a highest and best use that the market recognizes. So that would be, if you were to sell your farm today, what does the market consider to be the highest and best use of that property? This section of the report discusses, usually in fairly good detail, of why certain uses may not be the best use or why certain uses are. And this could get into, it talks about market area. I'll go back to example for our 80 acres of vacant, highly tillable crop ground. It's going to have an ag cropland or cropland highest and best use, as opposed to a very rolling pasture farm or 20 acres of timber. Each kind of property is going to have a different highest and best use. Like I said, in that section, it also will discuss any uses that may not be legally permissible, aka zoning. Maybe there's certain zoning regulations in the county that the property falls under. Physically possible uses. So if I'm down in a flood zone, I'm probably not going to be building a supermarket or my house down the flood zone. So it discusses those issues, and then also financially feasible, maximally productive, just on what's the best return use you're going to get out of that property. And then the final kind of key section that I think needs to be reviewed every time is just your reconciliation page. Kind of like the summary page, it's kind of like the end of the report. Here's another summary of the appraiser's findings. This is why I did what I did type thing. It lists out the different values concluded from the different approaches, as well as discuss some of the final findings, I guess. Moving on to the next section here. I've mentioned a lot our different approaches to value. So we're going to kind of dive into some of those here pretty quick. And this is a pretty brief kind of overview. But first of all, the cost approach is our first approach utilized within an appraisal. I'll just quickly read this definition here. the current cost of reproducing or replacing a building minus an estimate for depreciation plus the value of the land. So as you can probably gather from that definition there, we use the cost approach a lot on properties that are improved with structural improvements, whether it be houses, different sorts of facilities, or even sheds, grain bins, things of that nature. It gives us, we have various ways we um, determine a cost new of these different improvements. And then so we'll determine a cost, and then you got your age depreciation, obviously, but then throughout all your sales you have in your area, there's whether it be functional or external depreciation tied to that. We'll add those sales in, come up with that depreciation amount, and then at that point we have our depreciated value of our improvements, and then we're adding the land value to that, and then that is our indicated value from the cost approach. The income approach, we do use this a lot as a good good supporting value for ag land, ag purposes. Say for instance, our 80-acre tillable cropland farm will utilize market rent. You take out your management and maintenance costs, your taxes, and then you apply a cap rate, and that's going to spit out an income approach value. The income approach is good, but there's so much volatility out there in the market when it comes to cash rental rates that it's a good supporting value. But here in the ag world, we definitely use it, but it's kind of hard to hang your hat on sometimes, just because there can be so much discrepancy on what is the good actual market rent for a property. Sometimes in, say, if you're more in urban areas, condos, apartment complexes, things of that nature, income approach becomes a lot more viable there, just because buyers are looking a lot more at the income generated off that property. And finally, we have the sales comparison approach. I would argue the widest used approach throughout not just FCS, but the appraisal world in general. And kind of as the definition states there, the value indicated by recent sales of comparable properties in the market area. And I have another slide here that I'll show, but this, as I said, is one of the most widely used approaches, and it's taken directly comparable properties that have sold within your market, hopefully within the last couple of years, to compare to your property's land mix, to determine a value for the subject property. And this ties right along with the sales comparison approach and our sales we are going to use to value in the sales comparison approach. And in the appraisal world, we live and die by our sales. An appraiser is only as good as the sale data that he has collected, analyzed accurately, to use to come up with a value for your subject property. And I'll quickly read this here. Comparable sales are the foundation of all of our approaches to value. These are properties recently sold that are sufficiently similar to your property. In the ag world, a strong comparable sale generally needs to meet these criteria. The first would be sale date. I would argue 10 years ago, before we saw this great big jump that probably happened, I guess 5, 6, 7 years ago now. But 10 years ago, there was no problem going back to a 3-year time period to pull sales from, which 3 years in the appraisal world is a widely known time period that you need to find your sales within 3 years. As we all remember, things went crazy. Prices started skyrocketing. Ground was all over the place. There was times I was working on appraisals, and if I didn't have sales within the last 3 or 4 months, I just felt like I was so far behind, and not presenting an accurate value for today's market. but that's kind of how the appraisal world works. We kind of work in the past just a little bit because we're going off of past sale data. Um, but sale data is huge. Now that things have kind of leveled out a little bit and, things aren't as crazy, hopefully you can find something within the last couple of years. And that is you can feel pretty good about your timeline there. Um, the sale needs to be in your same market area. This is a huge one. And it takes time to learn these different market areas. I've had the pleasure of getting to know. I started out in central Missouri. I moved up to north central Missouri. Now I'm up here in north central Missouri. So that's 3 different times of trying to decipher and figure out these different market areas. And as you all know, you can be within the same county and you get close to this certain little town over here, and for whatever reason, there's influence, prices jump up there, and you go the other way, and for whatever reason, maybe there's negative influences and the prices fall off a little bit. So when you're selecting your sales for your subject, it's vital you got to pick the same market area. And just as a brief example, I wouldn't be up here in Nottoway, Gentry County, appraising a pasture farm and pulling sales from, Jackson County down by Kansas City, St. Joe. There's different highest and best uses. It's different market areas. So that's a real important one. Another real important sale, another important aspect of selecting a good sale for a comparable sale would be just your overall property's land mix. If I've got, back to our example, vacant 80 acres, highly tillable crop ground, I'm not going to be picking the 20 or 30 acres of timber that somebody bought to hunt on, or the 400-acre rolling pasture farm. It's just important that you pick properties with similar land mixes, slopes, soil types, all those things. You just got to get as similar as you can to your subject property. It's not a perfect world. Sometimes those sales aren't out there, but you got to do the best you can. The last two things that make up a good comparable sale, in my opinion, access is huge. You really got to have good access. It's crazy the amount of times you run into this issue. A sale, could be discounted. It's hard to say how much, but maybe there's the legal access back there. There's an easement, or not an actual legal easement in place. He's just been driving through, his buddy Joe's field for however long. And when you start getting into trying to gain legal access to a property, it's total question marks on how much money you're going to spend to get your good legal access. And when you're looking at sales, you really got to confirm that these sales have good legal and physical access, because that could play a big role in the end sale price. And for physical access, a lot like legal, maybe you could have legal access, a giant 30-foot ditch right across the road that is kind of inhibiting access to the rest of the property. And so those are all just really important things to look at and consider whenever we are looking at good comparable sales. And finally, it's got to be an arm's length transaction. This refers to, it kind of goes back to the definition of both motivated, buyers and sellers. That would typically be something, at auction. I feel like auctions are usually some of the good indicators of, good arm's length transaction, or realtors now, they usually things sell pretty well. An example of a non-arm's length transaction would be, maybe there's a tenant that's rented the farm for 30 years. Landowner decides he finally wants to sell, but he's going to give him a little break on price just because he's taking care of the farm. Things of that nature, family deals. Maybe the son's coming in buying out the dad. Doesn't always get sold at a discount, but sometimes it does. So when you're looking at good comparable sales, you really got to dive in and figure out the motivations behind these sales. I believe that's what I had there, Madison. If we had any questions come in, happy to answer those if I can. So.
Perfect. Thank you, Will. That was a lot of information in a quick amount of time. You can
Yes.
really really tell that there's so much data and strategy that goes into finding the true market value, and that a logistical location really, geographical location really does impact that as well. Perfect. Well, at this point, I am going to open it up for any questions that you may have for Will. You can use the chat feature or the Q&A to submit those in. I did have one come in from an attendee who reached out ahead of time saying that they were unable to attend this moment, but wanted to know that her and her husband are full-time farmers. They were in their early 60s and they have 4 children. They do have a successful operation. While they have some of their children who are around the operation and operating their own, they have 2 that do live out of state. They used to be member owners, but have FCS Financial, but are since paid in full, and they're looking at that estate plan. So they didn't know if there were any service, like appraisal services, because they've started that conversation and know they'll have to have their land-based evaluated, but they didn't know if FCS Financial, an appraiser as yourself, if that's something that they can do being outside of FCS Financial.
Yes, definitely. And that's, we always try to prioritize our current customers, current workloads. But we are encouraged, if we have some capacity there, we do take on fee deals. And the majority of the ones I do, just like you mentioned, they're for kind of estate planning purposes. Maybe grandpa died, something along those lines, or they're just wanting to get an overall value for the estate and kind of doing some planning. So I do quite a bit of that. And that is a service that we do offer here at FCS.
So the easiest way, if somebody listening today is interested in learning more, timeline, fee structure, do they just reach out to their local FCS Financial office then to get in contact with that local appraiser?
Yeah, definitely. And the local offices, they'll know who they deal with, who's the appraiser for those counties. If you remember that map I showed, there's a lot of us out there. So just get a hold of your local office and they'll know who to put you in contact with to kind of get you squared away.
Fantastic. Well, I am not seeing, give a final call here for any additional Q&A coming in. I will let everyone know that this session is being recorded. So following this session, you will receive a follow-up email. That email will come to your registration inbox that you used, and it will have the full video recording, an additional website link that will have some of the print information that Will shared, as well as a link to our survey. So if you don't mind taking 60 seconds to provide your feedback about today's survey, or a survey about today's webinar, and that's really helpful for us. It helps us determine what type of speakers, what types of content are valuable to you in your operation to really help to drive what content we're showing you next. I would also like to remind you that the annual FCS Financial Photo Contest is currently open. I don't know about the weather in your neighborhood, but it's a beautiful day outside of my window. So if you are interested in always taking pictures around your operation, please head over to our website to submit those photos between now and June 30th. And then I will finally go ahead and ask you to save the date for our next Grow Together webinar on Wednesday, September 2nd. It will be at 12:30 p.m. We're going to be joined by Wesley Tucker from the University of Missouri in Extension for a session on navigating your estate and succession plan. So really hone in on those details that we'll just mention about and a fee appraisal option. So we want to be able to move how that future of your operation out of the plan in your head into a formal strategy that protects your family's operation legacy. So again, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for being part of the agriculture community, and have a great afternoon.